Hi, my name is Amir Ali Alibhai. I'm the head of performing arts here at the Aga Khan Museum, and I'm really excited about welcoming you to our 6th annual Duende International Flamenco Festival. This year, we're coming to you in a virtual manner. And although that's been disappointing on a certain level, it's been really exciting because we've had the chance to try new things and take advantage of the opportunities that are offered to us in these times. So we've featured many Canadian artists this year, local artists, but we also have international artists in the festival. And so I'm really glad we can still call it the Duende International Flamenco Festival. We start off today with a legend in North America, dancer, choreographer, filmmaker, Oscar Nieto, who will start us off by giving his take, his personal take as a dancer on the development of flamenco over the last 50 years. I hope you enjoy this program that opens our festival. And then tomorrow, on Thursday, we have a tablao that's being put together, a piece called Fantasia, that has been put together by Shirlita Pili and friends, many local artists here in Toronto. On Friday, we have Farnaz Ohadi, based in Vancouver, and her ensemble, the Mashreg Ensemble, and really looking forward to that particular take on flamenco from a Persian-Iranian perspective, so something a little different. And then finally, we have a collaboration, a work in progress, a finished work that happens on Saturday. The time is 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we'll be following that with a live panel discussion with the artists involved. We have Carmen Romero and Miriam Mendez and Emilio Ochando from Spain. So I hope that you stay with us throughout the next few days and enjoy the programming that we've put together for you. Have a great Duende.
Ole.
Hello everybody, my name is Oscar Nieto. I am the Artistic Director of Al Mosaico Flamenco Dance Academy and Mosaico Flamenco Dance Theater here in Vancouver. And I'm going to share with you some thoughts and ideas about flamenco and Spanish dance in the 20th century and into the 21st century.
Oscar Nieto, when and where did your flamenco dance career begin?
My career began in Los Angeles, California in the late 60s, 1960s. I worked with a gentleman by the name of Juan Talavera, and then I worked with Lola Montes, and in 1969 I worked with Antonio Gadas at the Chicago Lyric Opera House in a production of El Amor Brujo. Then I returned to Los Angeles and I continued my work with my first dance company, Mosaico de Danzas.
Oscar, what is your opinion about how flamenco and Spanish dance was presented prior to the 1960s?
Spanish dance and flamenco dance were presented pretty much the same way from the early part of the 20th century right up to the early 60s. By that I mean that Spanish dance companies that were touring, in this case the United States and North and South America, were presenting a repertoire that included Spanish classical, Spanish neoclassical, some Spanish regional dances, and a little bit of flamenco. Nowadays we think that it was always flamenco, but it was not the case until the latter part of the 20th century. The people who were directing companies, people like Pilar Lopez, Lola Montes, La Argentinita, were presenting this diverse type of programming. Carmen Amaya was the first one that came to North America that was presented what they called at that time gypsy dance. And she brought a troupe of her, mostly family members, to do the flamenco part, But as Lola Montes, my mentor, said, because she worked with Carmen Amaya, that Saul Hurok, the impresario that was presented Carmen, knew that he couldn't present a full program with simply flamenco. So they brought in Antonio Triana to choreograph Spanish neoclassical and classical dance. And if you could see some of the program of that era, you'll notice that some of the pieces of choreography were mounted to Spanish composers rather, that were very popular at that time. Composers like Granados, Albeniz, De Falla, and Rimsky-Korsakov. So it wasn't just flamenco. So that type of format continued mostly through the whole first half of the 20th century. Then in the latter part of the 20th century, around the time that I started studying and rather performing, things were beginning to change. And a lot of this had to do with the cultural revolution that was in some ways called the hippie free love cultural movement, which a lot of the young people were taken by, including myself. And so some of the younger dancers started to incorporate different elements of this new cultural movement into our choreographies. The other advent that was to change a lot of what the young people in Spain were seeing and feeling was the advent of television. Television arrived in Spain in 1959, and there's a wonderful book about the Spanish bullfighter El Cordobés, who became an idol and an icon. And in his book, Or I'll Dress You in Mourning, they talk a lot about the history of Spain during this era. This was around the time that Franco was still in power, and a lot of things were taboo. The church had a lot of power, and so people were told what to do and how to dress, and so it was still a very conservative time in Spain. So the younger generation began to rebel against these restrictions. And this affected and began to affect Spanish and flamenco dance. As well as things changing in North America, things were also beginning to change in Spain. With the arrival of the military bases in Spain, in southern Spain, a lot of the gypsies and young Spaniards were introduced to rock and roll music, or music from Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and LSD, the drug that was to change many people's way of looking at life and seeing and hearing things. They were excited by this music, and they began to create bands like Smash, Ketama, Pata Negra, that were incorporating some of these rock music elements into their music. And by association, this also affected composers like Lotli and Manuel. They began to write themes of their generation, songs with themes of their generation, rather than the songs that had been sung since the Spanish Civil War.
So, Oscar, if the music changed so much, how did that manifest in new ways that flamenco dance was being interpreted?
Well, one of the ways, I think, in my opinion, is that the introduction of the cajon into musical ensembles began to affect the way dancers were doing their footwork. It became much more complex and intricate. And also because the traditional flamenco songs were being written with more diverse melodic structures and different letras that heretofore hadn't been used. For example, composers, writers of flamenco songs began to include the poetry of Federico Garcia Lorca, who had been banned during the Franco era. And at this time also, Spanish dance, Spanish neoclassical dance, began to sort of fade out because the younger dancers wanted to do flamenco. They weren't interested in doing Spanish classical dance. So for a time, it kind of went into serious decline. But now in the 21st century, it has re-emerged, and fascinating new combinations of Spanish neoclassical and classical dance and flamenco are being interpreted and presented. Dancers like Emilio Ochando have taken on the classical dance but added new elements to it. So there has been tremendous change since the 70s, but we're talking about the 70s right now. And in the 70s, all these changes began to happen with flamenco song, dance, and music. In fact, Camarón de la Isla, a very famous flamenco singer, recorded an album, La Leyenda del Tiempo, with Tomatito. And this was, now it's considered a real important change in the evolution of flamenco music. But when it came out, it only sold a few thousand copies because Spaniards, frankly, didn't like it. They thought this was not flamenco and that they were destroying flamenco. So it took foreigners to notice this change in flamenco music, and they were wondering why Spaniards didn't like it. In time, Spaniards, especially the younger Spaniards, really took to this evolutionary change. In 1998, I traveled to Spain to research this evolutionary process that was happening, that actually started happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I began to see that Spanish dancers that were traveling here from Spain were beginning to dance in a different way. So I went to Spain to research these changes rather, and three constants kept coming up. The three constants were the Spanish Civil War, the death of Franco, and Paco de Lucia. And I thought, why those three things? Well, as it turns out, because of the Spanish Civil War, a lot of artists, in our case, dancers and singers and flamenco musicians, left Spain. Some went to North America, some went to South America, some went to Europe. Those who went to North and South America couldn't come back to Spain, and even if they could, there was nothing to come back to because Spain had been devastated by the Spanish Civil War. There was no money, there was no food. They called this time Los Años del Hambre, the years of hunger. And when Franco died, all of Spain's ears and eyes were open to outside influences that they had not heard or seen before. Franco died in 1975. In the same period, Paco de Lucia introduced jazz harmonies to his music, and he added percussion to his musical ensembles, including bass and congas and flute and so forth. So this was a big change in the music scene. Well, this music change or revolution also affected or began to affect how dancers were interpreting the music. So that was another giant step forward in terms of the evolutionary process of flamenco dance, song, and music.
So if changes in music had such a huge impact on the way flamenco was being interpreted in the 70s, how about other dance forms that weren't from Spain?
Well, according to some of the research I did, in the 1980s, modern dancers, jazz dancers, and of course the music was coming into Spain, and this was affecting how dancers moved. Prior to this period, dancing had pretty much been with the elbows up and the arms in a certain position for flamenco dance, and the body had been relatively rigid. With the introduction of modern dance, this line was broken, and you could now do movements such as this. The torso had changed in terms of its rigidity, and new rhythms were also being created for footwork. So it opened up a whole new field of dance possibilities, as well as musical possibilities, because satellite communication also came to Spain, and MTV and rap music and hip hop and all that started to come into Spain. And also Spanish dancers had traveled to America, had seen what the American dancing was like, and they brought back to Spain some of these newer ideas. I performed with Cito, a grand teacher that in the mid-70s, and when he returned to Spain, he was the teacher to go to. Anybody who was anybody in Madrid always went to study with Cito, and I believe it was his time spent in North America that influenced the way he approached flamenco dance choreographies.
So Oscar, since the 90s and with the beginning of the 21st century, the 2000s, what would you identify as some of the big changes that you're seeing in flamenco?
Well, one of the biggest changes I've seen in flamenco is the growing pool of musicians who aren't just flamenco guitarists, I mean not just flamenco guitarists, but are also pianists, flautists, violin players, and so forth. A good example of a pianist is Maldonado, Dorantes, Jorge Pardo also changed the direction of the sound of flamenco music and also composition-wise. And this in turn has affected the choreographer's approach to flamenco music rather than just the guitar with these other instruments. And it has opened up a whole new generation of dancers that are doing incredible things with their feet, pyrotechnical footwork that we wouldn't have dreamed of when I first started flamenco dance, and different directions in choreographies. Dancers like Israel Galvan, for example, Rocio Molina, Belén Maya, have taken the dance world by storm, and in fact some people applaud what Israel Galvan is doing. They call him the Picasso of flamenco dance. But some people, quite frankly, hate it. Even his father, when he first saw what Israel Galvan was up to, didn't understand it and didn't like it. And he says it himself in some interviews. He didn't understand what Israel was doing. A lot of people don't understand what these modern or contemporary flamenco dancers are doing, to which this has also opened up or reignited interest in the older types of Spanish dances that would have been done to Spanish classical music by composers that I have already mentioned, like Albéniz and Granados and so forth. In fact, one of the composers, Isaac Albéniz, was featured in the film Iberia that was produced by Carlos Sauda. And by the way, Carlos Sauda has been instrumental in helping to spread the world of flamenco outside of Spain with his films of Carmen, Blood Wedding, El Amor Brujo, and so forth. And I think he produced a film on the Jota, which is a regional dance from the northern part of Spain. So this has brought Spanish and flamenco dance to the whole world. And of course now with the internet and YouTube, anybody, anywhere in the world who has internet connection can see flamenco. And now it has become popular in not only Spain, but in France, the United States, South America, the Asian countries, and now in China there is also a lot of interest in flamenco dance. And I, in my way, have tried to reintroduce the Spanish classical and neoclassical dances to people that I work with here in Vancouver, so that that part of Spanish dance history will not be lost. But things go in circles. Sometimes things go like this, and then they'll go like this, and then they'll drop off. And sometimes things will circle around and come back as a new form through the years, as I have seen. I've even attempted my approach to flamenco dance with a choreography that was inspired by Buto dance, which is a Japanese dance form that came out of the Second World War. So there again is this cross-pollination that affects all of us who are creative in the dance world.
So Oscar, with all of the changes that you've seen and been through in this crazy art form called flamenco, where do you see the relationship between, say, Spanish dance and flamenco going in the future? And where do you see other dance forms merging and melding? What direction do you think we're going to go with that?
Well, my hope is that, as I mentioned earlier, that things will come back full circle. And one of the reasons I say that is because I think just about 90% or 99% even of dancers that are professional dancers in Spain have studied and continue to study ballet. Because if you're going to be in the company of like the National Spanish Dance Company of Spain, you have to have ballet. You can't get around that. And a lot of dancers today are so superbly trained in ballet, in jazz, in modern, and of course, flamenco. So it's gone back full circle, and I hope it continues to be that way. I think one of the things, and now we're going to talk about a little bit of flamenco. Flamenco is a living art form. That means it is changing. It takes from the present, whatever is happening today, and it is incorporated into the music, song, and dance. And I think if it stays true to its core, which is the cante, it'll stay its course. Now, some people might branch off and go in a whole different direction. I think that's okay. I mean, that's the nature of art. You can't contain art in a box, because then it becomes a museum piece, which is okay also if you want to go to the museum. But if you want to see a living art form, you have to see what's happening today in theater. Unfortunately, in this year of the COVID-19 crisis, so many dancers and theaters have been shut down. And hopefully something will come out of this, something creative will also come out of this terrible time. And we will once again be able to go see some of these extraordinary dancers who are carrying the torch from my generation, from previous generations, and so forth. So to cover, in this interview, we've gone from the early part of the 20th century, companies like Pilar Lopez, Argentinita, Carmen Amaya, to the mid-century companies like Rosario y Antonio's Ballet de Madrid, Jose Greco's company, Lola Montez's company, and other companies that were touring. And now, after the 70s, rather than these large dance companies, they became more ensembles, because the cost of traveling was so expensive because of the gas crisis of the 70s, that most companies had to downsize. So then we had smaller flamenco groups that took over. Then the flamenco craze started in the 70s, I believe, and continued right up to the beginning of the 21st century. And now we have a whole new generation of dancers, musicians, artists that are taking the art form to who knows where, but I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful place of creative art. Ole, viva el flamenco!